Do you want to get rich quickly? Like really quickly? Well, this is not the video for you then. In this video, I'm going to be telling you guys the simplest and easiest way to build wealth over the long term. And the long term is around 20 years. Yeah, I know, it's not that sexy, but the good thing is that anyone can do this. All it requires is a bit of patience and discipline. So what is the simplest and easiest way to grow your wealth over the long term? It's by simply owning a piece of the global economy. As the global economy grows over time, your investment will grow over time. And we can do this by purchasing a global ETF, or exchange traded fund. A global ETF pools investors' money together and then uses this money to buy shares in companies across the world. And you just make one purchase into this global ETF, and from that you own pieces of companies all around the world. Mr. Worldwide. And as the global economy will grow over time, so will your investment. You don't have to worry about picking the hottest stocks or the hottest industries. You don't even have to look at a financial statement ever in your life. You just consistently invest in a low-cost global ETF and watch your money compound over time. Just to show you guys the power of investing in a global ETF consistently, I'm now going to show you guys some projections of how much money you could end up with if you invest consistently over time. So I'm going to make some assumptions about you. You live in a developed country and you're absolutely average. You make the average OECD salary of $48,500 a year. You save and invest into a global ETF 7% of your salary each year. This means that each month you save and invest $283 into a global ETF. After 40 years of investing this 7% of your income each year, you'll end up with around $1 million in your retirement account. How is this possible, you might ask? Well, over the past 120 years, the global stock market has averaged a return of around 8.2% a year. So if you take that money that you invest consistently over time and you compound it at 8.2% a year, after 40 years, you end up with around $1 million. And that's great, but there's one thing we forgot to take into account, and that is inflation. Inflation is the thing that makes everything more expensive each year, and you might want to hold on to something while I tell you about this. Taking into account the historical average of 3% inflation in your investment returns, your $1 million is actually only $463,000 after adjusting for inflation. In 40 years' time, you will have the same wealth as someone today who only has $463,000. So $1 million 40 years from now is actually only going to be $463,000. All this hard work for 40 years and you're not even a millionaire yet? I know, it sucks. What happens if you save more money and invest more money into a global ETF each year? Let's say instead of saving 7%, you now save 15% of your income. That's $606 per month. After 40 years, you will now have $2.27 million. And after adjusting for inflation, this is now $982,000. So you're almost a millionaire after adjusting for inflation. The more you save and invest, the more money you'll end up with after 40 years. Here's a little chart that shows you how much money you could end up with in retirement based on how much you invest each month. So after 40 years, if you save 20% of your income each year, you could be a millionaire if you make around $48,500. Most people, unfortunately, even though this is quite simple, they won't do this. I mean, it's very easy to look at these projections. I haven't even been doing this for 2 years, but I can imagine it would be very hard to implement this over a 40-year time frame. But if you're dedicated and if you're disciplined, it is definitely possible. So now that you know the benefits of investing consistently in a global ETF, which global ETF do you actually buy? Here are some of the best global ETFs that I've found for European and US investors. If you live in Europe, you're going to either want to use the Vanguard FTSE All World UCITS ETF or the iShares MSCI All Country World Index ETF. If you're in the US, just keep it simple and use the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF. For the European investors, the two ETFs that I mentioned are the best because they have the lowest expense ratios. The expense ratio is just how much you pay each year to the managers of the fund. And there shouldn't really be much difference between the FTSE All World or the MSCI All Country World Index. Over the long term, they'll end up with very similar returns. So MSCI and FTSE are just two different companies that make indexes that funds can track. So they're the company that actually decides what goes into this global ETF. They've essentially created the benchmark for the global economy. The MSCI ACWI index, which is the MSCI All Country World Index, combines companies from both developed and emerging markets. The developed economies make up around 87% of the ETF, and the emerging economies make up only around 13% of the ETF. It has around 3,000 companies in the ETF and covers around 85% of the global stock market. The iShares MSCI ACWI ETF is just an ETF that actually tracks this all-country world index. The FTSE All-World is another index that tracks the global economy. As I said before, FTSE is a different company, so they create the index in a slightly different way. The main difference is that the FTSE All-World index actually has around 4,000 companies and covers anywhere from 90 to 95% of the global economy. When choosing which global ETF you want to invest in, the cheapest is actually the best option, because this means that each year you're paying less to the management, so you get to keep more of the returns for yourself over time. And because these ETFs are all relatively similar, over the long term they're going to have very similar returns, returns, but the main difference is going to be how much you've paid in fees over time, and this can greatly reduce how much your money compounds. Another important distinction is that you want to make sure that the ETF is accumulating or capitalizing. Accumulating and capitalizing both mean the same thing. It just essentially means that the dividends that these companies pay out each year actually get reinvested automatically back into the ETF. So it automatically reinvests the dividends into the ETF. You don't have to do this by yourself manually. If you don't buy an accumulating ETF, instead of the dividends being reinvested, they'll actually be paid out to you and put into your account. It's important that you ensure that your ETFs are accumulating, because this means you have to do a lot less work and you don't have to reinvest the dividends yourself. Also, the difference between the returns of an accumulating ETF where the dividends are reinvested versus an ETF that doesn't reinvest the dividends can be a huge difference over time. And because these global ETFs are market capitalization weighted, it means that they will allocate to each country based on its relative size in the global market cap. So for example, the US market is around 58% of the global market cap, and hence in this global ETF, it will allocate 58% of the assets into the US stock market. This is the beauty of the global ETF. You don't have to worry about which countries are going to do better than others. The ETF will just reallocate the assets based on each country's global importance in terms of market cap. The globally diversified ETF gives you a whole allocation to the global economy. It makes sure that if things go bad in one country, you still have another 180 to back you up. This reduces your overall risk because you're not too dependent on each country. Also, because since we don't know which markets will outperform 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 6 months from now, it's better to allocate to all of them, and you just end up getting the global returns of the market. You're never going to beat the returns of the global economy, but you will always ensure that you get the returns of the global economy. So essentially what you want to do after this video is, if you don't already have a brokerage account, go and open a brokerage account. A brokerage account just allows you to invest in these ETFs. And then once you have opened up a brokerage account, you can find the ETFs that I mentioned in this video and start consistently investing in them over time. So this is great. You know which ETFs to buy, and you know all the benefits of investing consistently into global ETFs. But you may be wondering, how can I get more returns in the global economy? So there are some ways to sort of optimize this allocation to potentially do better than the global economy. One way to potentially do this would be to allocate more to emerging markets. Emerging markets currently have lower valuations than developed markets, and they also have a higher potential growth rate in the coming years. If you want to learn more about this, you can check out my previous video where I talk more about the benefits of investing in emerging markets. And if you noticed before, the MSCI All Country World Index, very similar to the FTSE All World Index, only contains around 13 to 15% of the actual assets into emerging markets. If you want to build an investment portfolio where you have more emerging markets so that it's more representative of their contribution to global GDP, what I recommend you doing is having one global ETF and then one emerging markets ETF. This is something that I'm doing in my own passive portfolio. So in my passive portfolio, I have allocated 40% to an emerging markets ETF. This is the iShares MSCI EM UCITS ETF, and then 60% to the MSCI All Country World Index ETF. So I end up with China having around 19% of the allocation in the total portfolio, the US making up around 36%, and then internationally developed markets making anywhere from 15 to 20%. And this is a lot more representative of what global GDP actually looks like. If you want to lower your returns, you can actually add bonds. And I know that might sound crazy, why would you want to lower your returns? But bonds in a portfolio actually do play a role. I personally don't have any bonds. If there is a market crash and you hold a bit of bonds in your portfolio, your overall portfolio will not go down as much. I don't seriously know why any young person will want to hold bonds, especially now. Bonds are mainly for old people approaching retirement and people who are scared of market crashes. I'm joking, but not really. Bonds will reduce your returns as they have a long-term average return of around 2%, whereas global stocks have a long-term average of around 5.2% after adjusting for inflation. Bonds will help your portfolio stay more stable over time, especially during market crashes. The downside, however, is that they reduce your long-term returns. Okay, great. You know a lot about global ETFs, and you know the simplest way to build wealth over the long term. All you have to do is open up a brokerage account and consistently invest each month portion of your salary into global ETFs. This will ensure that your money grows over time as the global economy grows over time. It is really the simplest and easiest way to build wealth over the long term. If you have enjoyed and you have found this video useful, please smash the like button and then hit that subscribe button down below. It really helps support the channel. Let me know in the comments which ETF you guys will be using, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.